For these recipes, you'll need comfy garlic oil and garlic butter on hand. To be fair, it's only about a tablespoon of garlic oil, so you can get away with using just plain olive oil here, as it's already required as part of the bread dough. Hey, it's Maher, and in this video, we're going to be making an Italian-style pan bread, which is a staple item found on the Earls menu. Commonly served with olive oil and balsamic vinegar, pan bread tastes great on its own, lightly buttered, or dipped full out in creamy Parmesan dip. In this video, you'll see me make a half-size loaf with a reduced batch size. If you choose to reduce your batch size like I do, keep in mind that you might need to adjust the cooking times to get the best results. The dough may also rise slightly faster with a reduced batch size, and it's very important not to overproof the dough. To start, you'll need to mix 3 cups of all-purpose flour with 3 cups of high gluten flour, which is also known as bread flour. Of course, 2 tablespoons of instant yeast is needed for the mix in order to form the base of your bread dough. To add fragrance and aroma, add a dry spice mix consisting of 2 teaspoons of oregano, 1 teaspoon of rosemary, and half a teaspoon of dried thyme. Then add 1 teaspoon of sugar and 1.5 teaspoons of fine ground salt. It's important to ensure that the dry ingredients are well mixed before adding any liquids to avoid any clumps in the final dough, so take a moment to stir it up with whatever utensil is easiest to grab. Once the dry ingredients are mixed, add 2.5 cups of warm water and 1/4 cup olive oil into a small well made into the center of the mix. Give it a stir with a spoon or your hands, and that will eventually turn into a nice hands-on kneading motion until a nice dough is formed. It should be firm and slightly tacky, but not moist and sticky. A little flour or water can be added as needed to get the right consistency, but be careful not to overdo it. It's best to take it a tablespoon at a time. Knead the dough for about 5 minutes, aiming for a smooth and firm texture, and then set it aside in a warm place to rest for about 10 minutes as you prepare a large baking sheet with a lining of parchment paper. If you're using a dark, non-stick coated pan, you can choose to lightly dust the pan with all-purpose flour or semolina flour to prevent sticking and give you an easy release from the pan once done baking. After resting the dough for a few minutes, you should see it start to grow in size. Take the dough and place on a lightly floured surface to be stretched out. A rolling pin with light pressure can be used to get an even thickness throughout the entire loaf, and once you have a sheet of dough roughly the same size as your pan, transfer the dough back into the pan so it can rise again. Just before setting it to rise again, take something like a wooden dowel or a chopstick and poke small pokes into the dough evenly spaced along the entire sheet. This is a process called docking, and it helps the dough retain its shape in the oven and prevent any large bubbles from forming under the crust while baking. Once again, set the dough aside for about 30 minutes until it's roughly doubled in height, while you preheat the oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit and set the rack to the lowest height available. After the dough has once again doubled in size, lightly drizzle comfy garlic oil across the top and evenly coat the top with the brush. Sprinkle coarse ground salt on the fresh oil right before baking and place in the oven for 15 to 20 minutes. The top should come out evenly poofy and golden toasted, and as the cookbook describes, hollow sounding when lightly tapped. Let it cool for just a moment until you can safely touch it with your bare hands, and immediately transfer the bread to a wire rack to finish cooling. It's important not to let it cool in the pan, as it still contains a lot of moisture in the form of steam. Leaving the loaf in the pan will cause the bottom to get soggy during cooling, and so a wire rack helps keep the air flowing around the bread, allowing it to cool without retaining any unwanted moisture. After cooling thoroughly, the bread can be placed back in the baking tray for storage prior to serving or slicing. It's best to slice immediately before serving to keep the edges fresh, as well as lightly toasting the bread to restore a light crisp to this crust for dipping. Wow, those are words I can't say. Like I mentioned, dipping bread in creamy parm dip can sometimes be a meal on its own, so if you enjoyed this video, check out the other videos in this series for that recipe, and as always, you can check out my website, heysmaher.com, for everything else I get up to. As always, thanks for watching. Woo, cut. 6 minutes.